Israel passed this week a bill that has brought in criticism even from its closest allies after the parliament voted to ban the UN's Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, effectively stopping all operations in Gaza and the West Bank. Two bills were passed with overwhelming majority. The first, to stop the relief agency's activities in Israel and occupied East Jerusalem. The second, to ban the Israeli state from interacting with the organization. This means no financial operations and a break in the aid supply chains into Gaza, where the north has already been starved, bombed, and besieged for nearly a month. The decision deals a serious blow to the 75-year-old organization. UNRWA was established in 1948 to provide relief to 700,000 Palestinians who were expelled from their land in what is called the Nakba, or catastrophe. After the Arab-Israeli War in 1967, Israel and UNRWA signed a treaty. This is now set to expire under the new ban, which comes into effect in 3 months. The agency, analysts have said, is crucial to preserve the prospects of self-determination and the right of return for generations of Palestinian refugees. There is no alternative to UNRWA. That's what UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, a message echoed widely by humanitarian aid groups and world governments. UNICEF has called the ban a new way to kill children. Even the US has said it was, quote, deeply troubled by the legislation and hopes Israel will pause its decision, at least. But this isn't the first time that UNRWA and the UN more broadly have come under attack, physically or otherwise, by Israel's government. The war in Gaza has been the deadliest for UN workers, killing more than 220 staffers from the relief agency. Its aid facilities have been targeted and destroyed in Israeli attacks, and crucial funding to UNRWA was cut off by Western states after Israel accused some of its members of being involved in the deadly October 7 attacks. But will this latest effort to shun the UN have more serious consequences for Israel? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. This week, we look at the impact of the Knesset's UNRWA ban on Palestinians in Gaza, and we examine the legal consequences it could or should have on Israel. The scope of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is unquantifiable at this point. In the weeks-long siege and continued airstrikes and violence in the north of the Strip, horrific scenes are unfolding before our eyes. Hospitals are completely decimated, people are starving, and only a negligible amount of aid has actually entered. Not nearly enough for what the people really need. And the death toll only climbs and climbs. Chris Gunnis is a former director of communications and advocacy at UNRWA and says the new bill will make a dire situation even worse.
This is going to turn a humanitarian catastrophe into a humanitarian apocalypse. And I use that word advisedly because I believe that what we're seeing is history's first televised industrial-scale death camp. It means, first of all, that 400,000 people who are being forced out of northern Gaza will not, if implemented, have an organization to give them shelter, to give them clean water, to give them medicine, to give them food. It means that 1.5 million people reliant on UNRWA for food handouts will not get those. It means that 650,000 children will not receive an education. The list goes on. It's absolutely appalling. And I hope the world will not allow this decision by the Knesset to be operationalized on the ground.
The war has also taken a toll on the agency's workers on the ground, who have not only been working under impossible circumstances to try and bring relief to the population, but have also come under attack themselves.
We've heard the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations call for the UN to be destroyed, and on the ground, we've seen 70% of UNRWA's facilities in Gaza either being damaged or totally destroyed. We've seen snipers taking aim, Israeli snipers taking aim at first responders. That's the reports we're getting, certainly from the north of Gaza. So yes, UNRWA is absolutely under threat. And my concern is that rogue elements are going to take revenge on UNRWA as they see it because of this legislation. But what is remarkable is that although 225 and rising members of UNRWA staff, the highest in a single conflict in the history of the UN, have been killed, the staff remain absolutely committed to their mandate. Many have remained behind in northern Gaza, despite the Commissioner General telling them to move south. And I have no doubt that in spite of this decision by the Knesset, is the staff of UNRWA will continue as they can and within the resources they have to deliver services. And they realize that only the General Assembly gives UNRWA its mandate, and only the General Assembly can change that mandate.
Chris says the Knesset's decision could have serious consequences for any long-term prospects for peace.
It's very bad news for the peace process. This is a unilateral attack, first of all, on Palestinian self-determination, because it's aimed at denying the 5.9 million refugees registered with UNRWA any say in the final peace process. But it's also an attack on the very idea of a peaceful resolution, because make no mistake, there can be no just and lasting solution to the Middle East peace process unless 6 million of the refugees, the Palestine refugees, are brought out of their statelessness and dispossession. So without that happening, the Middle East will remain an inherently unstable place, and Israel will remain an inherently insecure place.
Israel may also need to consider the impact of its decision on its own interests. Chris says not only could this decision compromise Israel's standing at the UN, but could also have legal repercussions.
To be frank, it's entirely illegal what the Knesset's done. It's a violation of the UN Charter. It's a violation of the 1946 Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the UN, which grants the UN all sorts of privileged status. Thirdly, it's a violation of the rules of belligerent occupation, under which Israel is obliged to deliver services. And very lastly, it's a violation of the Genocide Convention, which makes it very clear that these kinds of actions are utterly illegal.
Could Israel really be expelled from the UN because of this? Or should it? I discussed this with Saul Takahashi, an international human rights lawyer who used to work with the UN Human Rights Agency in Palestine. I asked him whether the Knesset's decision can stand up to the standards of international law and the UN Charter. Saul, back in February, the International Court of Justice issued provisional measures to Israel, obliging it to facilitate the distribution of aid in Gaza. Not only has Israel continued to obstruct aid, as documented by human rights groups, but it has also banned the most important organization in the Strip from operating. The Israeli decision has been called illegal and a violation of the UN Charter. Is this decision also a violation of the ICJ order? And what other international laws could Israel be breaking in making this move?
First of all, it is definitely a violation of the UN Charter and of various treaties which Israel has signed on to, not the least of which are the treaty which outlines the privileges and immunities of the United Nations. It violates the order, the binding order of the International Court of Justice, which told Israel in no uncertain terms that it had to make sure that there was adequate humanitarian aid going into Gaza at scale, but it hasn't been anywhere near enough. So we have this very unprecedented situation where we have a UN member state, which is basically thumbing its nose at the United Nations, at international law in general, and at the entire international system. And this really is, it's an accumulation of decades and decades of impunity that Israel has enjoyed. It's a serial violator of its obligations as a UN member state to abide by UN Security Council resolutions. I think it was the last resolution that was adopted by the Security Council, one of those very unusual ones where the Americans didn't veto. The Americans just immediately tried to explain it away by saying that Security Council resolutions are not binding if they're not adopted under a certain procedure, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. But this is not true. The UN Charter says very, very clearly that member states have obligations to abide by the decisions of the Security Council. It's very, very clear. And there's also a procedure for expulsion of a state that refuses to abide by its obligations. It's not directly connected in the text with the obligation to abide by Security Council resolutions, but it's obvious that that's part of it. You have to abide by certain obligations. First and foremost, you have to be a peace-loving country. And I would certainly argue that already Israel fits the bill of not fulfilling that fundamental requirement.
So there's a very big difference between what is being done, what can be done, and what should be done, which brings us to my next question, which you just talked about, that Israel should be suspended from the United Nations is what you're advocating for. But do you think that's actually going to happen, given who the biggest ally to Israel is and the veto power that the US holds?
There's a formal process under the UN Charter for expelling a state or even also suspending a state from the UN. But that has to go through the Security Council. So I think it's pretty clear that that's not going to happen in the foreseeable future because the Americans, let's all say, the Americans are going to protect Israel and they're going to veto that process. But even should that happen in the General Assembly, the General Assembly has its own procedures to deal with this kind of thing. That with South Africa, they basically maneuvered around the requirement for a Security Council recommendation. But it's not necessarily just a rubber stamp technical exercise. I mean, it involves governments making statements about whether they recognize the legitimacy of particular governments. What I'm saying is it's a technical procedure, but it has political aspects.
Saul, in the case of South Africa, the UN Security Council could not expel it, but the UN General Assembly was still able to discredit it from participating. Did this have any impact on South Africa at the time, and how can this or other measures be taken by the UN to hold Israel accountable, if not by expulsion?
So what happened in the case of South Africa is there was a proposal for South Africa to be formally expelled. The expulsion procedure, it has to go basically to the Security Council. So no surprise, what happened there was the Western countries protected South Africa. And so the Americans, the Brits, and the French all vetoed this course of action. So that fell apart. But then it went back to the General Assembly. And the General Assembly basically said, look, we're just in the face of the Security Council inaction, we've got to do something. And so basically what they did, they used the credentials process to basically disqualify the South African delegation from coming to the GA. They basically said, look, we don't recognize you as a legitimate representative of anybody, basically, and certainly not of the South African people. And so South Africa was suspended from the GA in de facto. Basically, they couldn't come to the UN General Assembly, which basically amounted to a suspension from the United Nations. And that was the case until they dismantled apartheid. We could debate about whether that's ideal, but the point is that's a practical way to go forward, perhaps within the UN framework to hold Israel accountable. But something has to be done.
Can you explain to us the difference between the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council? What would a suspension of or expulsion of Israel from the UN General Assembly mean versus a suspension from the Security Council?
The Security Council is basically the only body of the United Nations that can issue an order for enforcement action on all its members. So basically, it can adopt a resolution saying all member states must exclude Israel from their national fora and must levy economic and political sanctions against Israel. From here on, no member state is allowed to provide weapons to Israel. Theoretically, that's the kind of thing that it could do. And it's done that, of course, like, for example, with Iraq in the first Gulf War. After 9/11, also various resolutions were adopted about terrorist funding and that kind of thing. So it's the only body that can adopt resolutions that are mandatory to enforce international law. But the catch of that, of course, permanent member states of the Security Council, they have a veto power. When the Security Council does not fulfill its mandate, there are other processes that the General Assembly can use to try to push forward the cause of international peace and security. But the catch is that the General Assembly, unlike the Security Council, cannot adopt a resolution that dictates enforcement. It can't adopt a resolution saying, okay, all member states of the UN must levy economic sanctions against Israel. It can adopt a resolution, and recently it has, saying that we really believe that all member states should do this. It's like a technical decision saying we do not recognize this delegation, and we're going to continue not recognizing the delegation from Israel insofar as it continues to defy international law.
Did anyone surprise you in terms of the statements that came out condemning the Israeli decision to ban UNRWA? We've seen US mildly criticizing this and saying to pause the vote. But we also saw Germany coming out, which has been staunchly pro-Israel during this past year.
Well, I mean, it's not such a surprise, frankly, because, first of all, the atrocities that Israel is committing in Gaza are just so undeniable. And the groundswell of support for the Palestinian cause is at the point where really governments simply can't ignore it. But the thing is, look, words are cheap. words are cheap. And we've seen before how, the Americans, needless to say, but the Europeans as well, they issue these statements, we are gravely concerned, but it doesn't do anything. I mean, without teeth behind these kind of statements, they're just going to remain words on paper. And the Israelis will ignore them. The other thing is that it's also important, the International Court of Justice, besides those binding orders on Israel to stop actions which could violate the Genocide Convention, besides that, there's also an advisory opinion that they issued in July, stating in no unclear terms that the Israeli occupation of the 67 territories is illegal, that Israel has to vacate it, that countries should make sure that it vacates it, and that there should also be a ban of provision of weapons and other economic sanctions. The General Assembly has also adopted a resolution basically stating those terms. We don't have to wait for action or instructions from the Security Council. That's the kind of thing that should also happen immediately. The UN exists to uphold international law. That's what it exists for. But the UN is at its core, it's a club of nations. It's a club of countries. There's no God-given right for any country to be a member of the UN. And if we have a rogue state that is violating the rules, that persistently defies the authority of the United Nations, and this UNRWA ban is just the latest one of those, then look, we have to get together and say, look, this guy shouldn't be a member of the club anymore. What's going on here?
So is that what Antonio Guterres said when he said he's going to keep the UN General Assembly briefed on the matter? Do you actually think that Israel could, in our lifetime, be suspended or expelled from the UN, or even ostracized in one way or another?
Oh, I think there's a very big chance. I mean, I actually have no doubt that it will happen pretty soon, honestly. I mean, I think the suspension from the GA, a la what happened to South Africa, this is something that's actually very realistic. Remember, the UN General Assembly is one country, one vote, and there is huge amounts of support for the Palestinian cause amongst the countries of the world. And if you look at the Western media, it just makes it seem like, oh, Palestine, it's not really a state, nobody's recognized it, nobody accepts it. It's complete nonsense. I mean, over 140 countries have recognized Palestine as a state. And the Americans have not always been successful in their efforts to suppress the Palestinian cause in the GA. I mean, quite often they've been unsuccessful. The 2012 vote, for example, is just one example where the Americans, this was the vote that accepted Palestine as a non-member state to the UN. The Americans went around really trying to strong-arm other countries into not voting with the Palestinians, but they lost. They were not successful at the end. And I think there's a very big chance that this could happen very soon.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. This episode was produced by Fidat Jassim and Ben Balqawi. It was audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer, and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir.